The capture won't include any attendees other than the speaker and hosts. So our speaker tonight will be talking for about 30 to 45 minutes, and there will be a chance to ask questions. You'll see there is a chat button at the bottom of your screen. Please use that to type your questions into the chat box at any point during the talk. And my colleague Claire will collate them and will be putting them to Ewan at the end. This is the fourth in our series of free online talks, which aims to showcase the breadth of the collections held by Bart's Health NHS Trust archives and the diverse work of our researchers. For those of you who may not be familiar with the service, just a very brief introduction. The archives cared for by Bart's Health are amongst the largest hospital collections in the UK and amongst only a handful managed within a hospital trust. We hold records dating from 1137 up to the present day, including records of over 35 hospitals, as well as records relating to hospital staff, patients, buildings and management. We hold records of many other institutions, charities, organisations and individuals relating to healthcare and training. The hospitals and organisations for which we hold records, many of which no longer exist, are or were primarily located in the city in East London and are managed by Bart's Health NHS Trust or were run by one of its predecessors. St Bartholomew's Hospital is not just the oldest hospital in the trust, but it's one of the oldest, perhaps the oldest hospital in Britain, and certainly the oldest still located on its original site at Smithfield in London. The hospital was founded in 1123 and its medieval archives are extensive. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Ewan Roger, who has worked extensively with the records of the hospital as our speaker tonight. Euan is Principal Record Specialist in Medieval Records at the National Archives, specialising in records of medieval and Tudor England. Euan studied the medieval hospital of St Bartholomew's for his Masters and has published articles on the subject, as well as on quarantine and social distancing in pre-modern England. His work's featured in publications including Time magazine, The Guardian and The Times, and he's currently writing a chapter on the medieval hospital as part of an edited collection commemorating the 900th anniversary of St Bartholomew's Priory and Hospital, coming up in 2023. Euan's going to talk about his work exploring the hospital and its community in the 15th century, which is drawn on material held in our own collections, as well as at the National Archives and London Metropolitan Archives. So Euan, I am going to hand over to you.
Great.
Just bear with me. Right, are you?
Yeah,
feel free to share your screen.
I'll share that now. Thank you very much, Kate. Let me share the screen. Okay, so yes, thank you for inviting me to speak tonight. I hope you can see the slides on the screen. So this evening, I'm going to talk about Bart in the 15th century to see if there are any lessons we can learn, I think, from the medieval world about how a medieval hospital could be run. But before we get into some of the stories, a bit of context, and then I'll introduce some of the key characters that I'll be talking about. So I'm sure many of you may be aware of this, but medieval hospitals were not hospitals in the way that we might think of them today. So while surgery and learned physicians were very much a part of everyday medieval life, when we talk about hospitals in this period, we have to think more about charitable and spiritual support for the sick and poor, where care was focused more on hospitality and spiritual care than physical intervention. And sometimes this might include things like gardens. So an important part of the healing process within a late medieval hospital was gardens, and St Bart's had 13 gardens of varying sizes recorded in the 15th century. And the hospital at this time also had a reputation for looking after the children of mothers who had died in childbirth, and also single mothers from Newgate Prison. And they would care for children until they reached the age of 7, at which point they would be found a suitable trade. So we have to kind of break that link between hospitals now and hospitals then, I think. And more generally, however, at the beginning of the 15th century, hospitals throughout England were in quite a perilous position after years of abuse and malpractice. And there was a clear desire for reform across the board, with petitions claiming, for example, that whereas hospitals were founded and endowed to support the poor and feeble, these objects have been cast away. Masters and wardens of hospitals convert the goods to their own uses and consume them. And the same evil happened in not a few abbeys, priories, and collegiate churches. So this kind of ramshackle nature of English churches and the failure to implement any significant improvements before 1420 has led the mercantile elite in general to vote with their feet and move their patronage away from hospitals into new growth areas for charity and that kind of spiritual provision. So as a general context for my talk, we're looking at a period where there's a need for hospitals and their masters to fight back and regain the trust of this wealthy social group. And it's a programme of reform at St Bart that I'll be talking about particularly this evening. But before I kick off, how do we know about the hospital at this time and who are our main characters? Well, I'm primarily going to be talking about the hospital under the leadership of one master, a man named John Wakeryng. And so I'll start by introducing him and one of his chief officials, or at least the one we know the most about, his rental official, brother John Cock. And we know a lot about these two men thanks to an amazing book which survives in the hospital's archives, alongside many other medieval documents, which I've linked today with collections from the National Archives and the London Metropolitan Archives, as Kate said. So this book is called a cartulary, and I'll be saying that word a lot tonight. So a cartulary is essentially a large volume where religious communities would copy their most important documents for safekeeping. And the one held in the archives at Bart gives an amazing view into life here in the 15th century and earlier. And if you get the chance to go and look at it, you really should. It's absolutely amazing. And it's also full of brilliant marginalia, some of which I've included for a bit of colour in my talk tonight. But on to our main characters. So John Wakeryng, otherwise Blackbird or Blackbeard, the spelling kind of varies. I think it's Blackbird is what's intended here. Was served by John Cock during the whole of his mastership. John Cock put down in writing all the famous works of this master because it is memorable to recollect his wondrous wisdom and its extraordinary discretion. So that's how the account of Master John Wakeryng, the master from 1423 to 1466, that's how the account of his mastership starts in the 15th century cartulary. Yet in Wakeryng's case, and this is written by John Cock, in Wakeryng's case, this flattery may actually have some substance, because as we'll see, he was arguably one of a small number of mid-15th century heads of London religious houses who left their mark on society by virtue of their particular administrative zeal and ability. So a bit of background to Wakeryng. He seems to have been from Essex, from Little Wakeryng in Essex, hence the name. And it's very common among religious men at this time to take the name of where they've come from when they joined the church. And he briefly had been one of the brothers of the house before he had a very rapid promotion to master, which is where our story kind of really kicks off. And linked to Wakeryng, his chief biographer and fan, who we've already seen a little bit, was one of his chief officials, brother John Cock. Now, Cock is one of the few members of the hospital community for whom we have real evidence, mainly because he really liked to record his name, his insights, his thoughts for posterity. So he joined the hospital community around about 1418, when he was recorded as copying deeds for the hospital as a servant of a previous master. And he took his holy orders a few years later after quite a dramatic change of career. So he previously in his youth, he'd been apprenticed to a goldsmith. So he goes from training to be a goldsmith to joining the church and becoming this writer, this biographer, this rent official. And although Cock was brought into the hospital before Wakeryng's mastership, it was clearly Wakeryng that he felt he owed allegiance to, as was demonstrated by his gushing tributes that we've just seen. And he's an absolutely fascinating man. And the cartulary is often known as Cock's cartulary because of all these inclusions into the text he makes, and the rental of the hospital's London properties, which he compiled, although the manuscript itself was likely written by more than one person, although possibly under his supervision. And he seems to have thought in history, so he adds himself into historical moments in the hospital's history, as we'll see. And outside the hospital archives, we see annotations by Cock appearing in loads of different manuscripts, including Romance texts. And in all of these, he's adding, he's amending, he's trying to impose his views of history. So we do have to kind of view this whole talk tonight and what we're seeing through the lens of John Cock, because he's the one who's kind of defining this, writing this, editing. So we have to bear that in mind. And I do also wonder if he is responsible for some of these marginal doodles to be found within the cartulary. So this one we can see on the left of the screen here, there's the figure kneeling down, praying. His face appears a few times throughout the cartulary. I wonder if that's meant to be Koch's own image of himself. Okay, so let's get into the first of our lessons from the 15th century Barts. And these are lessons in quotes, I would say, and they're not meant to be serious lessons. They're kind of what's happening in the 15th century. So the first one, establish your independence. So as a bit of context, as I'm sure many of you will be aware, St Bart's was founded in Westmoreland in 1123 by Rahere, and it initially consisted of a priory of Augustinian canons with a church and a hospital house. But after Rahere's death in 1143, the priory and hospital soon split from one another, and they often squabbled over several contentious issues. This included the question of who was responsible for overseeing the appointment of the hospital's master. The priory thought it was below them, the hospital thought they could appoint their own. And this is quite an important consideration, both in terms of the power dynamic between the two institutions, which would be contested regularly, but also in terms of who is to receive and benefit from new gifts, bequests, or grants. And by the 15th century, several attempts at the regulation of this relationship had already been made by successive bishops of London. So most importantly, Bishop Sudbury of London had laid down ordinances in 1373, which gave the hospital relative independence from its former sister priory, although with some stipulations. And this would be followed further by regulations put forward by Bishop Clifford of London in 1420. And these served mainly to reinforce the previous settlement. Again, this resolution was all about who appoints the masters. So we have one master, John Berry, for example, elected master, and in the description Koch gives, he's elected master by way of compromise in 1415. So that kind of hints at lingering issues, I would say, amongst this community. Now, the hospital's independence was crucial in allowing them to compete financially with both the priory and the other religious houses of London, mainly with regard to alms, offerings, burials, and other such forms of spiritual religious patronage. But by the time of Wakeryng's appointment, the hospital had gained nearly full independence. But the manner in which the squabble between the two houses is recorded suggests that there may have been ongoing tensions after this point. So the hospital's cartulary, for example, provides at one point a long recitation of all previous agreements and arguments around the hospital's independence, going up to 1420. Now, this account, which kind of is a copy of things that have gone before, is immediately followed by Pope Martin V's confirmation of these regulations, dated 1426. So that's during Wakeryng's tenure. So while this confirmation in itself doesn't really shed any new light on the conflict, it's accompanied by a note which emphasizes that this was obtained during Wakeryng's mastership. So this is seemingly no less than an attempt to credit Wakeryng for bringing this whole dispute to a good conclusion, even if he actually hadn't been alive when the first regulations were compiled. Now, this ceasing of hostilities didn't endure. So a further marginal note notes this confirmation was cancelled shortly afterwards. And in fact, the issue wouldn't be resolved until the 1440s and 1450s, when there was a new arbitration actually brought in by Wakeryng's request and through the input of three leading lawyers, one of whom he was associated with. So it's likely that Wakeryng has just been elected master, and his first thought is to try and gain confirmation of the hospital's rights as they were at that time. But they were still contended, and he wasn't able to consolidate this. And what I like most about this is that he doesn't just kind of put up with this. So he eventually gains this independence, full independence, but he's not below using this dispute to his own advantage when it's useful to do so. So in 1446, for example, someone takes out a debt case against him, the Collegiate Church of St John the Baptist that spoke by Clare. And so he's got this debt case going against him, and he pleads actually, oh no, I'm under an obligation to the priory. So because of that, both the prior and the Bishop of London need to come and answer this case as well. So of course that makes the case more complicated, and the whole thing drags on for almost another 20 years. And by this point, he's almost secured, he probably has secured the hospital's independence, but he's using this to his advantage in quite a clever way. And securing this independence was a really vital step in ensuring, as I said, the ability to compete with the priory, to elect its own masters without disruption, and to manage its own business in peace, even if Wakeryng is perhaps a bit cheeky from time to time. But moving on from that, now the hospital's kind of gained its independence, let's move on to look at what the hospital was doing on an everyday level to try and ensure its financial security. And this is that debt case that I was just talking about, where he blames the priory. So on to lesson 2. In order to compete, it was important for St Bart to provide an attractive alternative to the many other religious houses in and around London. So this lesson is diversify and improve your property portfolio. Now, the task facing the head of any house was to maximize his institution's income through acquisitions, improvements, and diversification. And it's in this capacity that Wakeryng really stands out. So copies of the property transactions can be found both in the rental that Cock compiled in 1456, which is in that cartulary, and also older deeds recorded in the cartulary and in the hospital's medieval archive. And from this rental in particular, it's possible to document both property repairs and transactions in the 15th century and the physical setting of the precinct and other premises in London. So many of the hospital's tenements were located in London, spread across nearly 60 parishes. And in the rental, they fall into 2 distinct categories, those within the precinct and those elsewhere in the city. And what we can see from these entries is a policy of expansion, consolidation, and diversification, some of which Cock explicitly links with Wakeryng's efforts. So for those of you, many of you, I'm sure will be aware of the hospital site, but this is a map of it as it stands in the kind of early 16th century. So the growth of the hospital precinct was of necessity limited by the wall surrounding most of the close. And it mainly took the form of small augmentations, such as Wakeryng's incorporation into the hospital close of a garden called Le Joyous Garde next to the cemetery, and a brew house called Le Hart's Horn in Smithfield. And I think we can see this on the slides here. It's located here. I think this is still part of the hospital. So if anyone listening tonight works around that area of Bart, you can tell your colleagues you work in what was a 15th century pub. And please tell me what that building's used for today. I'd love to know. So there was also a large tenement next to the Hart's Horn, which had been rebuilt by Wakeryng, along with other small buildings in Victory Lane. And all of these buildings were rented out to the Archdeacon of Middlesex. But what we can see here, as in many of the hospital's property transactions at this time, and particularly those associated with Wakeryng, is a policy of rebuilding where necessary in order that buildings did not become dilapidated, expanding the hospital's portfolio where possible, and a diversification of the types of buildings involved, notably brew houses and bakehouses, and changing the use of buildings from strictly residential to more lucrative business premises, including shops, offices, brew houses, and bakehouses, was a means of generating further rental income and seems to have been a key strategy at this point. And such a policy of diversification and consolidation wasn't unique to Bart at this point. But the rental account makes it quite clear that Wakeryng, Cock, and the hospital management, more broadly, paid close attention to the possibilities of such action. It's absolutely full of pubs, bakeries, and shops of all types. I'd love to do a kind of St Bart's pub crawl based on the cartulary. It'd be great fun to put that together. And apart from the Hart's Horn, across the rest of the city, there are at least 3 further instances of Wakeryng's direct personal involvement in this form of diversification. So we have the Greyhound on the Hoop. So when we have Hoop here, that's basically the signs that are outside these buildings. It doesn't just mean pubs, but a lot of them have on the Hoop as part of their name. So the Greyhound is a brew house in St Sepulchre without Newgate, and it's next to the Elms, the medieval gallows site at Smithfield. And this was converted by Wakeryng from a brew house into a bakehouse after the death of its brewer. But what's most interesting here is that it was rented out to one Stephen Paul, described in the cartulary as then the most successful baker in London. So he really is the Paul Hollywood of his day, but working in Smithfield. Now we'll come back to the premise of advertising shortly, but I think this is very much a deliberate policy of both ensuring a steady income stream from someone likely to be successful, but also drawing prominent individuals towards the area. And you can see here on the top left of the screen, that's where the Elms is from an earlier reconstructed map of London around 1300. So it gives you an idea of where this famous bakery would have been. I think it's around the top of that kind of triangle is where that would have been, or possibly to the right-hand side towards the top. Elsewhere in London, the Eagle on the Hoop, another brew house in St Botolph, was purchased by Wakeryng in 1438-9, while a brew house of the same name in Gracechurch Street was recovered by him 7 years later. And in this latter case, Cock notes that the recovery was undertaken at his earnest request, possibly implying that the property had been mismanaged by its tenant. And we see this kind of comment or request from Cock quite frequently, indicating that he and the hospital kept a very close eye on its tenants and how their property portfolio was being treated. And one of my absolute favourite marginal notes from Cock castigates a previous occupant of Le Lamb on the Hoop, a brew house in St Ethelburg within Bishopsgate, describing the tenant James Brampton as a counterfeit gentleman and never thrifty, implying again that in his eyes, the property had been neglected or mismanaged. And I should say here, the marginal picture isn't supposed to represent anyone in these records in particular. It's not meant to be Brampton, but it struck me as the kind of face Cock would have pulled when he was writing about Brampton, that kind of anger that his property could be mismanaged. And on several occasions, Cock complains of buildings being fraudulently obtained or converted without approval. So at a shop and tenement at the corner of Hosier Lane, called the Leaden Porch, for example, he complained that the Fraternity of Holy Trinity, Coventry, who owned a quit-rent hospital for the site, had allegedly received the property through fraudulent means and had craftily converted it into one house, which before was called the Leaden Porch and afterwards the Oliphant on the Hoop, so the elephant on the hoop. And bearing in mind this property was on the hospital's doorstep, you can see it just in that little yellow circle off Hosier Lane, it would have been pretty obvious to the hospital community, let alone the renter. So this is not a difficult change to spot, but nevertheless, Cock's attention to detail, I think, shines through here. And these comments contrasted sharply to remarks about the hospital's other tenants, such as one James Thurenden, who rebuilt 2 rooms above the chapel of St Andrew within the hospital precinct and did many more good things in his dwelling place. So that's a much nicer comment from Cock here. Likewise, the large tenement and garden owned by Thomas and Alice Porthalen, so Alice had actually lived there with her 2 previous husbands, William Markby and Richard Shipley, before their deaths. They were praised by Cock for carrying out much building and who built in stone a kitchen, rooms and other pleasing items, and who improved it very much. And several other building works by the hospital's brothers and tenants were also noted without this kind of comment about how good or bad they'd been. So the Chancery Clerk, Richard Sturgeon, for example, rebuilt a large tenement with a garden where he was recorded as living in 1456. Now, he wasn't praised by Cock, but the rewards for those who were prepared to invest in such properties are quite clear, because Sturgeon paid only a nominal rent of 1 rose per year for life, despite his tenement's annual rental value of £4. So through this policy of expansion, diversification and improvement, both by Wakeryng's initiatives, those around him such as Cock, and his own tenants, the hospital was able to ensure a firm financial footing at a time when other institutions around the country were struggling. But this wasn't the only way to secure patronage and income to St Bart. So the next lesson, advertise your charitable credentials. So one of the major responsibilities of the hospital, and indeed other religious institutions of the period, was the need to both perform and encourage charitable works within the community. So as I've already mentioned, St Bart's had this reputation for looking after children, single mothers from Newgate Prison, and caring for these children until they're old enough to go and find a trade. But in order to fulfill these duties, they needed continued patronage to fund their good works. And as Carol Rawcliffe has observed, in order to survive the impact of economic, social, and demographic change, hospitals had long been obliged to respond pragmatically, assuming new or different functions as circumstances and patrons demanded. And I think that's the perfect phrase to describe Barts at this time. And furthermore, the provision of charitable or educational facilities with wise investments and up-to-date commemorative functions could in turn be a means of attracting further patronage for the hospital, as patrons sought fashionable and popular ways of fulfilling their charitable desires. This could be inspired by means of advertising through grand monuments, an impressive liturgy in the hospital's church, the possession of a status symbol such as the Chronicle, or the nostalgic memories of a former schoolboy. So how did they promote their charitable and educational status at Barts? Well, as with his actions around the hospital's independence, one of Wakeryng's first acts was to try and secure the legacy of his predecessor, in this case, Master John White. So White had been named as one of the executors of the wealthy mercer Richard Whittington, receiving both a payment for his work and a bequest of 100 shillings for the poor of the hospital, to be distributed at White's discretion. Securing this gift, however, had been complicated by the former master's death, and Wakeryng had to recover items and sums of money from both Whittington's and White's executors. And you can see some of them listed in that. This is that description of Wakeryng at the start of in that list of masters. So it's really important to Cock and Wakeryng that this is recorded. And he's eventually able to recover lots of valuable goods, but also an annual quit rent of 20 shillings for a tenement which had been for many years in arrears. The question of how Whittington's bequest was to be spent, however, was one that now came into question, because Wakeryng manages to secure a bit of a coup here in determining how this happens. So simply giving the money to the poor was one option, but it was a time-limited one. It would only last until the money was all handed out. Instead, he manages to get the executors to invest it instead, through the construction of a huge new south gate at Barts. Now, the idea is this gate would display Whittington's coat of arms, acting as a sign of the hospital's connection with him, and also as a sign of patronage for the hospital, while an expensive window was also to be installed within the church, and it was a huge cost to put these in, much more than Whittington's original sum of money. So this dual move both advertises the hospital and its patron to the outside world, but with that window, which has images of charitable works, it also offered the dual assurance that Whittington's generosity to the poor would be remembered, and that his soul would be prayed for as well. So that's quite an inviting prospect for others seeking similar salvation. Give us your money and people will pray for you in the future, and people will remember you. And this is quite indicative of what he does overall. He tries to make the hospital a desirable place to live and encourages others to invest in the hospital and its charitable works. So that's kind of the standard Wakeryng playbook, I would say. He also tries to improve and maintain education throughout the hospital. So this is the fundamental part of life within any religious house in this period, not just amongst the community that lived there, but also children living within the vicinity. And there had long been a school or schools at St Bart. But by the 15th century, however, it definitely employed, we can see, a master of Latin. And we can see John Bart being recorded as schoolmaster of the hospital of St Bart's, both in his property transaction and other cases as well. So Wakeryng's keen to promote this tradition, and he actually on one occasion poaches a schoolmaster from St Paul's, which is one of obviously London's top religious institutions, and one that he's very keen to copy where he possibly can. And we have lots of other instances within wills. So Beatrice Lurchen's will, for example, bequeaths 2 pence to every child of the grammar school of the hospital, who helped to escort her body after death for funeral elsewhere, while other wills, such as the lawyer Robert Warner, made in 1439, he left bequests for the brethren, sisters, children, and the poor dwelling there. So we can definitely see there's this group, at least one school, possibly more, within the hospital. But in a further attempt to seek this kind of intellectual reputation at Bart's and to further copy St Paul's, we also see attempts to copy the St Paul's book-selling tradition on Paternoster Row by trying to attract similar figures to Duck Lane, which runs along the east side of the hospital precinct, and to encourage bookish types, such as a man named John Shirley, who's a kind of well-known at the time medieval bookseller and copyist. And he rents a tenement in the precinct, is buried in the hospital church with a now lost brass. So we can see Shirley being attracted to this new reformed institution. But alongside this, we also see the hospital's own group, own officials, own brothers, filling the same kind of gap. So we see Koch, for example, possibly at Wakeryng's commission, trying to write a chronicle, which is quite a significant medieval status symbol. But this isn't entirely successful, however. So the list of kings, which only takes one page of the cartulary, was copied from an existing list at St Paul's. And from what we've seen about Koch so far, you can probably imagine what he does to the text, because he adds himself into the history. And we can compare the text of his chronicle against the St Paul's one, and it shows he makes slightly small changes, small edits throughout. But as we get to the period of history that Koch knows about, has experienced, has knowledge about, he starts to add more detail. So my absolute favourite is the entry for Henry V's coronation. And he says, which day was Passion Sunday, and it was very rainy. And I know this because I, Brother John Koch, was there. So he's putting himself into this history. And we can see a similar attempt being made in his list of masters, where details of the early masters can be a bit dodgy, the dates possibly wrong. But when we get to Wakeryng's mastership, we find a lot more detail. So while this might be an attempt to emulate St Paul's, develop a chronicle to demonstrate this kind of learned status, it's perhaps slightly undermined by Koch's over-enthusiasm. Even the cartulary itself is quite a status symbol on its own. And the final point I want to mention in this section, in terms of promoting the precinct, is his attempts to invest patronage relating to the water supply and the provision of fresh water to the hospital. So in 1433, Wakeryng does this deal with his neighbour, the Priory, to extend their water supply and bring piped water into the hospital precinct. So the water supply, which they brought in from Islington to the Priory, had become damaged. But in comparison to the hospital, the Priory didn't have the money to repair this. So the hospital and Wakeryng step in and say, we'll repair it, that's fine, and we'll pay you for money, but we want half the water, we want to siphon off half that water to come to the hospital. And they say that the lack of fresh water has led to increased sickness, and that's where this has all come from. Now, whether or not that's true, we can't say for sure, but clearly this is an attractive move, both in making the precinct a more pleasant place to live and work, and to the refreshment of the sick and poor within the hospital. But it also, in turn, encourages further charity. So in later years, for example, we see members of the community granting the hospital land and buildings to extend that water supply down to Newgate and Ludgate prisons to provide water for the prisoners. So Wakeryng is kind of making his precinct nice, but also encouraging further charity and further payments for charity from his parishioners, as we'll see in a second. Because by this point, we can start to think of them as parishioners, and the hospital is in a strong position to start to challenge other institutions. And this is kind of reinforced by the fact that the hospital precinct isn't a parish. It's not a parish church. It's extra parochial, outside of that parish system. But it seems that Wakeryng encourages his tenants, and particularly those in the precinct, to think of it as a parish. And a lot of them start to describe it as a parish. So Thomas Loyt, in the will, which you can see at the top of the screen here, who's a legal clerk in the Westminster Law Courts, He describes it, he wants to be buried within the chapel at St Catherine, Virgin and Martyr, within the parish church of the Holy Cross, called St Bartholomew Spital. And even in legal accounts, we start to see similar descriptions. So in this bottom image, we can see a legal account where we're seeing the parish of St Cross within St Bartholomew's. So this is a real push to try and think of this as a parish, because if you start to think of it as a parish, that means you can access extra financial streams, but you also encourage this real sense of community within the people living in this area, and people start to support each other more, start to support the local church more. So this is a really clever move by Wakeryng to try and secure his patronage. And the final lesson I want to talk about from 15th century Barts is around the type of people Wakeryng seeks to develop and bring into this community, who could provide grand, conspicuous patronage alongside prayers and charity for the poor and sick. And hospitals at this time served quite a unique dual role in both minimizing a patron's time in purgatory by dispensing charity to the sick poor, while also providing a ready supply of patients and clergy to pray in perpetuity. So if you make a bequest and ask people to pray on your behalf in the church, there's a lot of patients that are going to be coming through that space and praying for you. And they are the kind of worthy poor. So they're good prayers that you can have. So encouraging this is a good move from Wakeryng, and very, very important, particularly in London where there's a lot of competition. And given the complex nature of all of these disputes, legal transactions, property disputes post-mortem, it's perhaps not unsurprising that he quite encourages lawyers to come into the area. So there are quite a few lawyers that are living in the close. And in 1456, we have, for example, Robert Danvers. So he's the Recorder of London, and he's going to be the future Chief Justice of one of the central law courts. He's an important man in legal spheres. And he not only has a tenement with a garden, but he leases 2 shops next door for his clerks to work in. So this is establishing Bart as a location where lawyers can work. And this happens until the 17th century. Indeed, St Bart's is the location where the records of the Court of the Star Chamber were last seen. So if anyone has an unopened cellar or anything like that, please have a look, just in case there are some nice legal records in there. And obviously having these men around is quite useful for Wakeryng, because you can deploy them if you have disputes and disagreements as well, which he often has, both through their connections between Wakeryng and these people and their vested interest as tenants. And we do see some of these issues taking place. So we have the Chancery Clerk, who I've already mentioned, Richard Sturgeon. He's particularly active, as is the rest of his family, in being patrons for the hospital. And he actually founds a chapel in the hospital, the Chapel of St Mary and St Michael, and a chantry there for the benefit of the souls of his family. But there's a whole huge dispute around this foundation over the grant of an area called Duckett's or Doggett's land around Tottenham. And what you see is the whole hospital community, all of these men with civil, royal, legal connections, jumping in to support Sturgeon and making sure that this all takes place. So here we can see a few examples of where people are stepping in and helping out and pursuing this case through the law courts. So in this type of situation, the more patronage you can get, the better. And the final point I want to make before concluding is that this is not just a space for men. I think this is really important. So the Rental of 1456 describes lots of women as living within the hostel precinct. So there are 6 women specifically described as a widow, who both rented and inhabited tenements and shops in the close. And a further 5 were named without their marital status being given. And these include women like Joan Astley, who had been Henry VI's chief nurse in his early years, and she lives above the Smithfield Gate in the precinct. And we've also got Dame Joan Clinton, who contributes to the hospital's building works. So she gives a sum of about £10 for the work on the new church of the hospital. And this is perhaps implying that she's given money to repair or expand the church that is still there today. And it's possible that she pays for work on the tower. And among others, we have potentially sisters of the hospital who appear to have been the ones providing care for the sick. Now, these are really difficult people to identify, but in the rental, we do get some instances. So we have 2 shops, as we can see here, rebuilt by Sister Emma Cherbury. And what's interesting about this is that the money from those shops is designated specifically for the sisters of the hospital alone. So the hospital gets 1 rose, but the sisters get 26 shillings and 8 pence. And we do get others like James Surrenden, who we heard about earlier, specifically making mention of these sisters and making bequests to the sick, which is to be distributed by these sisters. Now, women may have sought out the precinct for a number of reasons, one of which being the perceived security of its walls or the care and devotion environment that the community afforded to them. So there's lots of different ways, and there are some horrible stories about women being involved in sexual abuse and then coming to the precinct. So I don't want to go into those this evening because they are a bit horrible. But what I think we are looking at here is the community of wealthy individuals comprised of widows, high status professionals, and those with extensive royal, civic and legal connections, living in this gated community and looking out for one another, as well as the hospital's best interests. And they haven't ended up there by mistake, but through this detailed and ongoing work of Wakeryng to these long-term policies allowed to come to fruition, which allows Bart to fulfill its charitable, social and spiritual obligations against a competitive and crowded London market. So just one last point. I suggested this title as a slight light-hearted take on medieval hospital life. And I'm certainly not expecting hospitals to start investing in pubs and bakeries or to start any further disputes with St Bart's Priory. Although as an aside, I did regularly enjoy annoying my father with this suggestion because he was the CEO of a large private hospital chain when I was researching Bart. But surprisingly, he never took the bait and bought a pub. But are there more general lessons we can learn from Wakeryng, Koch and the 15th century? For me, what stands out in particular is that these aren't short-term policies that the hospital is putting in place, but long-term planning, an entrepreneurial approach combined with an effort to consolidate the hospital's position and ensure their charitable obligations were met in both the short and long term. And that's a risky business, particularly when recent masters had only held office for a few years each. But through investment in the precinct, its personnel and its community, while simultaneously ensuring the charitable and spiritual foundations that Bart was founded on, Wakeryng was able to look to the future and foster the strong and resilient hospital community which would survive through to the present day. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Ewan, for a fascinating talk. I've certainly learned a lot from it, and I'm sure everyone else here has as well. I'd like to voice my strong support for the idea of a historic Bart's pub crawl. I think that's just the research we want to encourage, so thank you for that. We've got some really interesting questions coming in, so I will start from the top. We've got one from Peter. Are there any signs in the cartulary of an interest in medicine at the hospital? In the 14th century, John Murfield, clerk of the Priory, had written the Breviarium Bartholomew. Might this have been known and used at the hospital?
So I think it probably was known and used, potentially. There's not very much evidence for it, which is very frustrating. We know very little about what actually happens at Bart's. Yeah, I suspect it probably was. I think we can tell from some of these wills, for example, that it's the sisters, and the sisters are kind of taking the lead on the care. But yeah, we just don't know. I imagine it must have been known about. Whether it was put into use on a regular basis, we just can't tell.
Thank you. This next one is from Edith. I think I could probably have a go at answering this one, but I'm definitely going to give this one to you because I'm sure you'll be a lot more eloquent than I will. This is from Edith. How much of the original hospital building remains in the current hospital grounds?
So very little. As part of my master's, I actually looked at the church, and there are bits of the church that still survive that are medieval. The structure of the church is largely, apart from the octagonal kind of end where the altar is, the structure of the west end of the church is quite similar to how it would have been, but a lot of the stonework has been reworked. My actual MA was literally, I took lots of pictures and drew all over them, which was old stonework, which was new stonework. It was great fun to do. But the church is the main bit that survives. Other than that, it's mainly the ground plan in places. But yeah, very little unfortunately survives. But I think the main kind of central plaza bit is still where Paradise would have been in the 15th century.
Okay, great, thank you. This one's from Philip. Is there evidence in this period of patronage from the aristocracy or the crown, or is it mainly citizens?
It's mainly, this is a very interesting one because we're in Henry VI's reign, and Henry VI is both very easy to get patronage from and very difficult to get patronage from, depending on what connections you have. So we do have a lot of royal officials who, there's little evidence of Henry himself giving patronage to the hospital. It's kind of filtered through these people. They make their earnings and they pass it on to the hospital. But there are instances, so with the water supply, for example, they have to go to the crown and get permission to do this. It's kind of agreed with the priory, then they go to the crown and say, we want to go under your highway, please let us. It's similar with the aristocracy. You get these kind of high-ranking servants of earls and dukes, but not necessarily that higher rank themselves. And I think in part, that's a London thing rather than necessarily just Barts. London is full of these kind of high status but not aristocracy figures, and I think that kind of reflects in Barts.
Great, thank you. There's another question here. Do you have information about disability at the hospital and how those people were viewed?
Disability is an interesting one here. We have zero records of the kind of people who are coming in for treatment. But things like disability often can manifest into poverty in that people can't work necessarily. And so they're what would be termed, I guess, the worthy poor. They're not just hanging out in street corners, they can't work. So there is that kind of aspect to things. There's a whole wider question about leprosy and that kind of stigma, which we probably don't have time to go into tonight, unfortunately. Disabilities are very interesting. Well, we know that people in medieval life got on with disabilities and got through, but I think we're talking about different, it depends on the level, I guess. And I say we don't know exactly who is going to Bart at this time, unfortunately, but it's the sick and the poor in particular.
Exactly, thank you. Question here from Tom Townsend. The archives of the Hospital of St Giles here in Norwich includes several series of 15th century account rolls. Does the Barts archive also hold such records for that period, or is the cartulary the main source for this fascinating talk?
So the cartulary, I would say, is the main. There aren't financial accounts. It's mainly the cartulary and property accounts that survive, and you get a few accounts around the Reformation. I'm slightly laughing because I can see Carol Rawcliffe in the audience, who is the expert on health in Norwich. So I'm not going to say anything about Norwich's records because she's on the call. But yeah, at Barts, it's mainly property, and it's kind of piecing things together from that, combined with things like legal records at the National Archives and testamentary evidence from elsewhere as well.
Great. And Tom also adds that bizarrely, the Bishop of Norwich for the early 15th century was also a John Wakeryng.
Yes, so I think it's possible they're related. I think they might be from the same area. I think the bishop is from Great Wakeryng, and I think Bart's Wakeryng is from Little Wakeryng. But I think Bart's Wakeryng is possibly playing up on the association, and playing up on association with a previous master, William Wakeryng, from the 14th century. So part of its geography, part of it might be playing up on it. And actually, I think the blackbird links to the bishop's coat of arms a little bit, I think, as well, off the top of my head. He's got blackbirds on it.
Yeah, great. Okay. And this next one's also related to finance, from Carol. Do you well, this I believe you just mentioned Carol, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so some of that you've already answered actually, Ewan, about do any accounts survive, to give us some idea of the hospital, but she also asked if you have any idea what the annual budget was.
That is a very good question, and I did know it. I don't know off the top of my head. It's quite substantial. They are doing pretty well for themselves. The part of the problem is that we only have the rental for London that's copied into the cartulary, but we know from the deeds they had lots of property elsewhere. So there is a figure, and there is a figure at the dissolution of the monasteries, and I cannot off the top of my head remember what it is, but I can, Carol, I'll send you I'll email you.
Okay, and then we've got one from Kate. Do you think John Cox's move into the church was motivated by a desire to be associated specifically with Barts?
Well, so that's a very interesting question, because one of the previous renters of the hospital is a man named Reynold Cox. Whether there's a family connection and its son taking on the father's old job, that's something that I've never really got my head around. I'm not sure there's the evidence to prove it. Certainly when he's an apprentice as a goldsmith, he's working nearby. So it would have been known to him. Mm-hmm. So I think it's entirely possible. But at the same time, I think it's also entirely possible that he was following his father's move there, but we just don't know.
Okay, great, thank you. So I've got a few minutes if anybody else wants to contribute any questions. In the meantime, I've got one of my own, which again, it may not be possible to answer, but I wonder, in terms of the hospital's income, if you have any sense of what the balance was between the kind of income from the property portfolio and philanthropy. Do you get a sense of what the balance was between those two incomes?
Yeah, so it's difficult because we don't know exactly what they're paying for in terms of philanthropy. We know they're doing it, and we know they're not complaining about doing it, which is one of the big flags for me that it was like things are okay. Because at other institutions, when they are struggling, that's when they go to the king and they say, we can't pay taxes, we can't fulfill our obligations and pay taxes. The fact they don't do that, or do that irregularly, for me is an indication that they're comfortable enough in doing what they're doing, and there's not too much of a problem. And I don't know how much their philanthropy costs, if that makes sense. Because, for example, when they're bringing in, say, children of single mothers from Newgate, or mothers who have died young, those children are then fulfilling, like, it doesn't cost a huge amount to feed a medieval child at this point. Particularly when you've got lodgings on hand, you don't have to worry about that. And they're also fulfilling this secondary role in your spiritual services. They're holding candles, they're praying, they're doing this and that. So in a way, I think sometimes their charitable outgoings overlap, and actually you can get two forms of charity in one small child, as long as you're training them and doing this collectively.
Great, thank you. And we've got one last question.
Okay.
From Lisa. What or who was the competition in terms of fundraising or property acquisitions at the time? Other hospitals or livery companies, for instance?
Basically any church around London. So lots of, obviously parish churches are slightly different in that they have their communities to work from, and they've got that kind of embedded community. But I think one of the big, particularly at the start of the 15th century, one of the big competitors are almshouses. So they're very similar in that they're providing lodgings, they're providing a kind of basic living for these people in return for prayers. And so one of Richard Whittington's a couple of his big requests are almshouses. So that's, I think, the major competition. There are other hospitals at the same time who are doing similar things. And so St Thomas Acre in London is a competitor, but what you also find is you find overlap between the members of the communities. So they do overlap. There's this kind of network between hospitals. So I don't think hospitals are competing that much. I think they're limited enough in London. What they're competing against are these almshouses and new forms of charity that are coming up, because they've mismanaged their hospitals for so long that people are saying, well, we don't want to give you money because you'll just waste it. And they're going out and proving that actually we can be trusted with your money, and we can make an amazing community, and we can display your patronage, we can have your coat of arms on the wall, we can have people praying for you. Almshouses can't do that. We have the structure to do this. So it's, yeah, I think that's the competitor to these new forms of charity that are coming out.
Great. Thank you very much, Ewan, for answering those questions so fully and for a really informative and entertaining talk. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you, and thank you to everybody who came tonight. So just to finish up briefly, if you'd like to see this talk again, or if you know anybody who couldn't make it along, because I know we were fully booked, the talk is being recorded, as Kate mentioned, so that will be going on our YouTube channel. I'll post the link up to that in a second. So it's, or you can Google it, which is Bart's Health Archives and Museums YouTube, and you should be able to get us that way. And you can also see the other talks in our series there as well. And we have the fifth and final so far talk coming up in this series on the 11th of November, where Dr. Richard Mackay will be joining us talking about queer men and venereal disease at East London's Whitechapel Clinic. So please do go on to Eventbrite. You can book your tickets there. I've just posted the link in the chats. So yes, it just remains for me to thank Ewan once again and thank everybody for coming, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.